Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face do? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face go? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face do?
Alrighty. Hello. Good evening. Eveninga. Where are my... Oh, I have to start the captions to get them to work. Here we go. Alright, so we are on to story number 13, I believe it is. That's what I numbered it. Yep, 13 out of 16. This one is called At the Crossroad, The Spacer's Tale. I do not have any memory of this character. Maybe it'll come to me as I read the story. So, some of these are pretty obscure characters in the Cantina. So, anyway, here we go. At the Crossroads, The Spacer's Tale by Jerry Oltian. The infinity was hot in more ways than one. Boshek smiled as he prepared to drop out of hyperspace over Tatooine. He'd just beat Solo's time on the Kessel Run. Of course, he was running empty, bringing in just the ship to have its transponder codes altered, but even so, it would be fun to tell the braggart Corellian and his furry sidekick he'd broken their record. The cockpit fit like a glove around him. He could reach all the controls from the single pilot's chair, and everything was right where instinct made him reach first. The windows wrapped around to give him almost a full circle of view, and a heads-up holo filled in the gap to the rear. In his 3 years of piloting smugglers' ships for the Monastery Forging operation, Boshek had never flown one so well designed as this. The computer counted down the last few seconds, then automatically switched to the sublight engines. Elongated star lines snapped back to points of light, and high to the left the bright yellow-white disk of Tatooine swelled into being. Holy bantha breath, it was close. Another second in hyper and he'd have popped out underground. He swung around so the navicomputer could get a straight shot at the orbiting beacons, but he was willing to bet it already knew where they were. Sure enough, within seconds, the planetary image in the nav screen filled with longitude and latitude lines then showed a sparse dotting of oases and settlements across the desert planet. Mos Eisley was about a third of an orbit away. Boshek was just about to accelerate toward it when the nav computer buzzed a warning, and two bright white wedges slid into view from around the curve of the planet. Imperial Star Destroyers. Boshek glanced out the windows and shuddered. They were so big he could actually see them with the naked eye. Where had they come from? Tatooine was so far off the beaten track, the Empire hardly ever sent a tax collector, much less a pair of warships. Somebody must have caused some major trouble while he was gone. And now their trouble was his too, because the Infinity was still running under hot transponder codes. If the Imperials bothered to scan for its engine's unique emission signature, and they no doubt would, then they would know it was a smuggler ship, wanted throughout the galaxy for tariff violation, tax evasion, gun running, and dozens of other crimes. The fact that Boshek was merely piloting it to Tatooine for someone else wouldn't save him in a trial, if he ever got a trial. For that matter, neither the monastery nor the Infinity's owners would be happy with him if he let the Empire confiscate the ship. His job was to bring it in undetected so the monastery's technicians could alter its codes and give it a clean record, not to lose it to the first patrol that happened along. Without hesitation, he aimed straight down and accelerated hard. In space, he wouldn't stand a chance against the destroyer's short-range TIE fighters, but down in the atmosphere with the planet to help confuse their sensors, he might be able to lose them. Tatooine grew from a sphere to a close mottled wall. The Infinity began rocking gently as it reached the top of the atmosphere. Then a bright flash came from the starboard side, and the ship suddenly lurched to port. The destroyers had opened fire. Boshek kept the Infinity aimed straight down, diving deep before he leveled out, knowing that the more air he put between him and the destroyers, the more shielding he would have from their turbo lasers. His passage left a glowing ionized wake behind him, but then he slowed to just a few times the speed of sound. He, but when he slowed to just a few times the speed of sound, he left no trace. He wasn't free yet, though. 4 TIE fighters from the warship arced into the atmosphere after him, and their closer range made up for the air's energy absorption. The Infinity once again shuddered under Imperial fire. Fortunately, they weren't trying to kill him yet. Confident that he couldn't get away, they were just trying to disable the ship and force him down. They were probably even trying to contact him by radio, but Boshek left the receiver switched off. Any transmission he could make would only give them his voice print. As it was, if he could lose them, he might remain anonymous. He shoved the throttles forward again, at the same time corkscrewing down and underneath the fighters to skim the sand. He was over the vast dune sea, far to the west of civilization. The wave-like dune field erupted into clouds of roiling sand as his shock wave passed over it. Lining up directly behind him for another salvo, the flat-winged fighters plowed straight through the clouds, the airborne particles etching away their instruments and control surfaces and pitting their windows. They immediately rose up above the billowing sand, but Boshek chose that moment to pull back on the throttles, letting them overshoot him. He banked left, waited until they had committed to a left turn, then banked hard right and shoved the throttles down again, racing for the Jundland wastes to the east. The TIE fighters were catching up again by the time the jagged canyon land slid toward him over the horizon. Boshek dodged a few last energy bolts, then dived into the first canyon he reached, and wove his way up it at top speed. The Infinity handled like a dream, hugging the ground as if on rails, but the TIE fighters were just as maneuverable. Only the damage they'd taken in the sand cloud kept them from catching him. Then one of them made a mistake. Closing in for a crippling shot, it crossed into the Infinity's shockwave, and the turbulence against its wide vertical wings tossed it like a leaf into the side of the canyon. The explosion sent another fighter into the ground, leaving only 2 to follow him. Losing half their number had changed the rules, though. Now they weren't shooting just to cripple, they were out for blood. Boshek frowned as he tried to think of a way to take them out first, but the Infinity was built for speed, not fighting. Fleetingly, he thought of calling upon the Force, of trying to use its ancient mystical powers to throw his pursuers off, but he knew it would be useless. He'd been meditating and concentrating on the Force ever since he'd heard of it from one of the few real monks at the monastery in Mos Eisley, but he'd never yet gotten an indication that it even existed, other than a faint awareness of other people's presence from time to time. The old Jedi might have been able to draw from it to subdue their enemies a long time ago, but the Force hadn't protected them from the advancing Empire. No, he needed something more concrete, something physical he could do to escape. Then he remembered a story Solo had told him once, about how he'd faked out a bounty hunter in an asteroid belt. Yeah, the same thing might work here. He led the fighters deeper and deeper into the canyon until its high walls boxed them in on either side. The Infinity shuddered under more and more impacts, and a flashing light in an instrument board warned of a shield about to fail. But instead of speeding up, Boshek intentionally slowed down. He rested his finger on the emergency escape pod launch button, and just as he rounded a sharp bend, he hit it. The escape pod blew free and continued straight into the canyon wall, where its fuel supply exploded in a spectacular fireball. Boshek kept his eye on the heads-up rear view, but neither of the TIE fighters emerged from the flames. Either they'd been swallowed up in the explosion, or they'd pulled up and were circling around to examine what they no doubt assumed was the wreckage of the entire Infinity. Smiling, Boshek pulled up out of the canyon, aimed straight east, and cut his engines completely. He had enough velocity to fly ballistic all the way to Mos Eisley, if he had to, and with his engines dead, the TIE fighters would never spot him. Solo, he said aloud in the close control cabin, I owe you a drink. Boshek knew right where to find him, too. Whenever the Millennium Falcon was on planet, either Solo or Chewbacca, and sometimes both, would be at the Mos Eisley Cantina, trying to drum up business. After he dropped off the Infinity at the monastery, leaving instructions for the mechanics to modify its engine transponders immediately, Boshek headed straight there, not even taking the time to change out of his flight suit first. The monastery was south of the city's center. He stopped for a moment at the ancient wreckage of the first colony ship, the Dowager Queen, to pass a sealed note from the abbot to one of the street preachers there, then hurried on. The streets were lousy with stormtroopers, but they didn't seem to be looking for Boshek. He saw 4 of them hassling an old hermit and a kid and 2 droids in a beat-up old land speeder. But they evidently weren't too interested in them either, because they let them go after just a few questions. Boshek ducked into the cantina before the stormtroopers could take an interest in him. It took his eyes a minute to adjust to the dark interior, but Chewbacca was easy to spot, towering above the other beings at the bar the way he did. Boshek wove his way through the crowd and leaned up against the bar next to him. "I beat your record," he said without preamble. Chewbacca grunted, the Wookiee equivalent of "get lost," but then Boshek's voice registered and he turned his head to ask what record Boshek meant. "The Kessel Run," Boshek said, grinning. "I beat your time by a tenth, and I had to take out 4 TIE fighters when I got here to boot." Chewbacca growled appreciatively. He howled a long, ululating phrase that Boshek translated as, "You'd better not let the customers catch you wringing out their ships, or they'll start taking their business elsewhere." "Hey, we're the best there is, and you know it," Boshek told him. He waved at the bartender, who shot him a surly look and turned away. "So how's the Falcon holding up? You need another code job yet?" The Wookiee shook his shaggy head, then hooted in laughter. He howled another phrase that Boshek tentatively translated as, "After what you charged us last time, we've been keeping our noses clean. It's cheaper." "Think of it as a life insurance," Boshek said, echoing the abbot's favorite sales pitch. He was about to shout at the bartender when he felt an unmistakable awareness of someone behind him. It was the strongest presence he'd ever felt. He turned as casually as he could and saw the old hermit and the boy in the doorway. The hermit's eyes met his, and just a hint of a smile showed on his grizzled face. Leaving the boy with their droids, he walked straight up to Boshek and said in an astonishingly rich voice, "May the Force be with you, my friend." The Force? Had he really felt it just now? Thanks," Boshek stuttered. "How did you know?" "Your struggles are as plain as words for someone who is trained to see them. I could teach you much, but I fear my time here is short. I need passage off the planet. However, since I believe you have a ship, perhaps we could further both our quests at once." Boshek could hardly believe what he was hearing. This old guy was practically reading his mind. Boshek had never told anyone about his fascination with the Force, yet here came this complete stranger who picked up on it immediately. But he'd gotten part of Boshek's story wrong. "I wish I did have a ship," he said, "but I'm just a pilot." "Ah, that's a pity," said the hermit. "Perhaps when I return we can discuss the Force anyway." "Yeah, maybe we can." Chewbacca growled softly, and Boshek took the hint. "I do know someone with a ship who might be willing to take on passengers, though," he said, nodding toward the Wookiee. "I see. Thank you." The hermit glanced toward Chewbacca, then looked back at Boshek and said, "I'll leave you with one piece of advice. Beware the dark side. Your role here on the edge of society has put you in a very ambiguous position, one that you must resolve before you can continue in your journey. Only the pure of heart can ever hope to wield the Force's powers with any success." "Thanks, I think," Boshek said. "You're welcome." It was clearly a dismissal, so Boshek bowed out with a nod to Chewbacca, letting them discuss business while he went around to the other side of the bar to get the bartender's attention. He'd finally managed to get a drink and was casting about to see if he could spot Solo when the old man pulled a lightsaber on a walrus-faced Aqualish and an even worse-looking human, and Boshek got knocked over in the rush to give them room. The Aqualish lost an arm in the fight, and the old man gained a wide zone of respect. But Boshek didn't care about either one of them at the moment, being occupied with wiping a pint of bitter off the front of his flight suit. Bloody brawls were nothing new in the cantina, and aside from the old man's lightsaber, this one was nothing special. But enough of the other bar patrons had spilled their drinks that it took Boshek another 10 minutes to get served again. By then he'd spotted Solo, but the Corellian was already deep in conversation with the old man and the boy, so he sat back down at the bar and waited his turn. Maybe he could learn something more from Solo about the old guy after they were done. While he waited, he tried asking around to find out what all the stormtroopers were doing in town, but nobody would admit to knowing. The Imperial troops had simply swooped down from their Star Destroyers a couple of days ago and set up roadblocks all over town, and in most of the other towns surrounding the Jundland wastes as well. They were looking for something, but nobody knew what. A couple of them came into the cantina, shining conspicuously in their white body armor. Boshek looked over to see how the hermit and kid would react to their presence, but they were already gone. He stood up to go take their place at Solo's table, but first the stormtroopers, then a long-nosed, green-skinned Rhodian beat him to it. Solo was a popular guy today. The Rhodian held a blaster pointed straight at Solo's chest. Boshek slipped his own blaster out of its holster, ready to help if it looked as though Solo needed it. But then he saw something that made him reholster his weapon and watched with amazement. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Solo was drawing his own blaster under the table. Sure enough, when he got it free of its holster, he gave a little shrug as if to say, "So long, sucker," and fired right through the table at the Rhodian, who collapsed forward on the smoking remains. Solo stood up, flipped a couple of credits to the bartender, and stalked out before Boshek could catch his attention. He downed his drink and followed him out, but he had barely made it out the door when he felt someone grab his arm, and an authoritative voice said, "All right, hold it right there, spaceman." He turned slowly to see a local cop pointing a blaster at him. "What's the problem?" he asked, keeping his voice as unconfrontational as he could manage. The cop scowled. "The problem is, a wanted starship ran an Imperial blockade, dusted 4 interceptors in the process, and landed here in town just a little while ago. Darth Vader's on one of the battleships and wants somebody's head for it, and yours looks about the right size to me. You're still suited up. How about you and me have a little chat down at the station?" Only his years of practice at talking his way through customs allowed Boshek to keep his expression neutral. Inside, he was close to panic. If they got him under a mind probe, they'd know for sure he'd done it, and there was a good chance he'd blow the monastery's cover as well. Either way, he was dead. Forcing himself to calm down, he shrugged and said, "You got the wrong pilot, I'm afraid, and there's a whole bar full of people in there who can prove it. I've been here all afternoon." The cop hesitated, looking into the dark doorway, and when he squinted to see inside, Boshek lashed out with a foot and kicked the blaster out of his hands. He followed with a punch to the side of the head, putting all his weight behind it, and the cop collapsed like a shorted droid. The blaster clattered to the ground a few steps away. Boshek lunged for it, but lost the race to a pair of Jawas, who scurried away with their prize and quickly disappeared among the dozens of taller aliens on the street. Boshek didn't particularly care. He had his own blaster if it came to that, and as long as the cop didn't, he was happy. He turned and walked nonchalantly but quickly away from the cantina toward the city's central plaza and the thickest crowds. He had only made it across the street and down half a block to the wrecked Dowager Queen when he heard a shout behind him. Few of the street's inhabitants even looked up, since shouts from the cantina were a regular thing, but Boshek quickened his stride toward the old colony ship's rusted hulk. Twisted girders arched out over the packed dirt. Awnings tied between some of them provided shade for the crowds gathered to listen to the street preachers pontificating from the upper levels. Ruptures in the hull and busted portholes provided glimpses into the ship's dark interior, from which the red glow of Jawa eyes peered outward. Boshek ducked inside the sagging cargo lock. The hold smelled strongly of Jawas, but he didn't care. The more the merrier, in fact. He stepped over vagrants and preachers resting in the shade, pushing past them until he was well hidden from the street. In the dim light filtering in through holes in the hull, he stripped off his flight suit and flung it farther into the darkness, keeping only the tool belt with all his personal belongings. A chorus of growls and high-pitched chattering erupted as the wreck's inhabitants quarreled over their new prize. His gray suit liner was a little less of a beacon for the police, but it still wasn't very good camouflage. Boshek knelt down beside one of the vagrants and said, 10 credits for your cloak. That was far more than it was worth, and both knew it. Without a word, the vagrant tugged off his rough brown robe and handed it over. Boshek paid him and wrapped himself up in the noxious-smelling garment, then pushed back toward the door. He had underestimated the cop's tenacity. He had evidently seen Boshek slip into the wreckage, and was now standing at the edge of the crowd with a small boot-top blaster in his hand. The crowd had thinned considerably under the policeman's glare. Boshek didn't think he'd be able to hide among the few people left. He turned and re-entered the ship. There had to be another way out of it. He stumbled over more bodies, circumnavigating the cargo hold, but all he found was a ramp leading up a level. Thinking maybe there would be a stairway back down over the outer hull, he climbed the ramp, but it only led to the observation deck from which half a dozen preachers harangued the crowd below. From his new vantage, Boshek saw reinforcements coming to the first cop's aid. He was trapped. They obviously weren't going to drop it, not with the Empire breathing down their necks. They needed a sacrificial suspect to deliver to the stormtroopers, and they weren't about to let him get away now. Which meant they wouldn't rest until they'd swept through the entire ship. Boshek looked around frantically, but there was no place to hide. The observation deck was even more open than the cargo hold. It had been gutted of everything that could be unbolted or torn loose, leaving just an empty floor with blasted-out windows spaced evenly around it. All but one of the window frames had a preacher standing before it, facing outward toward the people on the street below. None of the preachers were from the monastery. Boshek wondered why until he remembered the note he'd dropped off here on his way to the cantina. The abbot must have called them in for some kind of conference. With no place to hide and no friends to help him, he could see only one possibility. He bent down and smeared his hands along the floor near the wall, then wiped the grimy black goo he gathered there on his cheeks and forehead, darkening his complexion and making his face fit his clothing. Then he stepped to the window and said in a quavering voice he hoped sounded old and wizened, "Brothers, sisters, friends, and aliens, beware the dark side of the Force." A few of the people below looked up, squinting into the sun, and Boshek realized why his particular window was empty. Tatooine's twin suns were directly behind him from the vantage of anyone below. Not a good location for a preacher interested in gathering a following. It was perfect for Boshek, though. He pulled his hood over his head so nobody could get a good look at him from the side. Then he cleared his throat and began his sermon. Despite living at a monastery, he knew almost nothing about the religion they preached. He spent his time in the underground ship alteration complex, not in the cathedral the monks had set up to establish their cover. He knew their doctrine was all based on the divinity of banthas or some such crock, and had been borrowed from a group of true believers who lived out in the wilderness, but he had no idea how it all tied together. Far better, he thought, to preach something he at least knew a little about, though he didn't suppose it really mattered. Who listened to street preachers anyway? Remembering what the old man in the cantina had told him, he said, "Only the pure of heart can ever hope to achieve true mastery of the Force." A few more faces looked up, then away. Boshek spread his arms wide. "You must open yourselves up to salvation. You must cleanse yourselves, make peace with your inner natures, and accept the Force as your guiding principle." The preacher to his right had stopped his own sermon to listen. Boshek smiled nervously at him, then went on, "When you surrender yourselves to the Force, you deliver your lives unto the greatest power in the universe. With it, you can move mountains, see the future, and find an eternal life. Ha, he thought. This preaching stuff wasn't that hard. Just string all the buzzwords together and you had it. Another of the preachers fell silent. Boshek wasn't sure he liked their attention, but the cops had moved to surround the ship, and he could hear the commotion in the cargo hold as they began their search. And now, attracted to a scene of trouble like flying insects to light, a stormtrooper patrol was also heading toward the ship. Boshek pulled his robe closer about him and leaned farther out the window, saying, "Repent! Dig deep into your hearts, and the truth shall set you free." "Be silent," the priest on his right hissed. Boshek noted that he wore a robe considerably cleaner than his own, and his fingers and wrists were spangled with gold rings and bracelets. Preaching was evidently good business. "Be silent yourself," Boshek told him. He could hear the cops ascending the ramp now. "On second thought, don't be. Preach, or we're both going to be saying our prayers in jail." He turned back to the window and said to the crowd below, "There are disbelievers among you, people who deny the existence of the Force, or say that it's weakened with time and no longer useful in these modern days. But I say to you, every living creature that is born increases the power of the Force." The preacher, who had shushed him, glanced warily down the ramp, then turned back to his window and picked up where he'd left off, saying in a voice loud enough to drown out Boshek completely, "Consider the banthas of the dune fields. They quail not, neither do they sting. They are the holiest of beasts." Oh boy, this guy was the real item. Boshek was glad he hadn't tried to fake the monastery religion, although the preacher didn't seem too thrilled to be hearing a competing doctrine either. Well, it couldn't be helped. Boshek was committed now. The other preacher resumed his spiel, too, offering to heal anyone who tossed him money. Boshek gladly let them drown him out, babbling on about the Force merely to keep up his cover. He could sense the cops behind him, 3 of them sweeping blast rifles around the observation deck. He closed his eyes and wished for a miracle. Wished that they would just turn around and march back down the ramp and go away. A high-pitched Jawa voice chittered angrily from below. The unmistakable crack of blaster fire made Boshek nearly leap out the window, but he realized just in time that the shooting had come from outside, too. He leaned out and peered around the curve of the wall, and could just see the Jawa lying in a smoking heap on the ground. The patrol squad of white-armored stormtroopers stood in the middle of the square, waving their blast rifles around menacingly, but no one else fired. The cops behind Boshek rushed back down the ramp to investigate. Boshek leaned against the window frame for support, his legs suddenly weak. Whatever the Jawa had done, its noisy death had distracted the cops long enough for him to escape. He turned to go, only to meet a gold-fingered fist with his face. He staggered back and landed hard on the floor. "Mock us, will you?" the preacher snarled at him, aiming a kick at his ribs, but Boshek barely dodged. The other preachers quickly joined the first in kicking and hitting him. "Here's for trying to make people laugh at us," one of them said as he nearly wrenched Boshek's arm from the socket. "And here's for leading the militia up here," another said. Boshek scrambled to his feet, trying to explain. "No, wait, I didn't mean to," but they weren't interested in excuses. Under continual pummeling, he covered his head and dived for the ramp, rolled halfway down it, and came up running. He thought the preachers would leave it at that, but 2 of them chased him right out of the wreck and out into the plaza, where the police, gathered around the Jawa's corpse, turned to see what this new commotion was. "That's him," the cop said. The cop he'd knocked down shouted, and he snapped off a blaster shot that just missed Boshek's head, blowing a rusty attitude jet off the side of the wreck instead. Boshek leaped over the jet and dashed around the curve of the hull. Then, when he had its bulk between him and his pursuers, he sprinted straight down the street toward the thickest crowd he could see, the buyers and sellers in front of the Jawa Trading Center. The preachers were still hot on his trail, which was the only thing that kept him from getting a blaster bolt in the back. The police were evidently reluctant to shoot a bona fide religious leader, even by accident, probably fearing the trouble their followers would cause in retribution. Taking advantage of their hesitation, Boshek ran past the traders and on down the street toward the used landspeeder lot. He thought briefly of dodging through the speeders and trying to lose his pursuers that way, but as he drew closer, he saw the triangular-headed Arconan dealer gloating over a deal he had just made, and he realized his salvation was at hand. Running up to the speeder, the Arconan had bought a battered XP-38A with two engines on the side and a third up on a fin in back. He tossed a fistful of credits at the surprised alien, then leapt into the driver's seat and shouted over his shoulder, "I'm taking it for a test drive." "No, wait, what do you think you're—" the Arconan wailed, but Boshek didn't stick around to argue. The engines were still running. He jammed the accelerator on full and zoomed away, nearly running over a cylindrical droid before he swerved the speeder farther out into the street. The cops took a couple of wild shots at him, but the energy bolts only succeeded in making the people in the street dive for cover. Boshek zoomed down the clear avenue, took the corner at the end of the block at full speed, and continued on. 2 blocks farther, he slowed for another corner, then proceeded at a more normal speed to the next corner, where he turned again and tried to blend into what little vehicle traffic there was. His zigzag course was leading him in a loop around Docking Bay 94. Good. The jumbled streets dead-ending at the bay would keep the police busy for a long time if they even bothered to look for him anymore. He was thinking about ditching the speeder and heading back to the monastery when he turned around another corner and found himself gliding toward a patrol of 4 stormtroopers who stood blocking the street. One of the troopers raised a hand with his palm out, indicating that Boshek should stop. They didn't have their rifles drawn, which meant they were probably just stopping everyone on the street for questioning. Even so, there was no way Boshek could get past them or turn around and flee before they would unsling their blasters and take him out. He forced himself to let up on the accelerator and drift to a stop before the troopers, all the while frantically trying to think of a way out of this latest predicament. "What's your business here?" the patrol leader asked. His voice was distorted by the full battle helmet he wore, and the bubble lenses of his visor kept Boshek from seeing where he was looking. "I'm just headed down to the Cantina," Boshek told him. "I see. Is this your land speeder?" "I'm test driving it," Boshek said. "A likely story. Let's see your—" The stormtrooper's words were drowned out by the roar of a ship taking off under full thrust. Boshek winced at the blast as the ship cleared the rooftops, then did a double take when he recognized its outline. It was the Millennium Falcon. "Looks like the old man must have made it," he thought. "Too bad, in a way. He could have used a little bit of his luck right now." But it wasn't luck, was it? The guy knew about the Force, and by the way he talked and the way he handled the lightsaber, he was a master at it. He'd probably used its power to manipulate his way past all the obstacles. A little roadblock like this would hardly make him sweat. Well, Boshek was sweating plenty. The stormtroopers had all turned to watch the ship blast free. But they would be bringing their attention back to him soon enough. Go check out the docking bay, Boshek thought at them. Go bother somebody else. Whatever, just let me go. What had the old man told him about the Force? Beware the dark side, he'd said. Only the pure of heart can ever hope to wield the Force's power with any success. And he'd told Boshek he'd have to resolve his role here on the edge of society before he could continue his journey. Great. Stealing the land speeder had probably nixed whatever chance he'd ever had at using the Force. But he hadn't actually stolen it now, had he? He'd tossed the Arconian, who'd bought it, at least 50 credits, and while it was true that he'd only been hoping to keep the land speeder dealer from raising the alarmed for a few minutes, he could still take it back. All right, he thought, directing his thoughts out into the vastness of space where he imagined the force accumulated. I'll take the speeder back just as soon as I get free, and I'll quit running hot ships for smugglers, and I'll clean up the rest of my act, as long as you get me out of this mess. He didn't really expect it to work. The Force wasn't some judgmental god deciding a person's fate. Like the old man had implied, the Force just was. It didn't care what Boshek promised. The power to manipulate it came from within, and Boshek wasn't foolish enough to believe he had reached internal harmony in the last few seconds. But maybe, just maybe, he had changed enough to make a difference. He concentrated all his effort on the stormtroopers, willing them to let him go, and he was almost sure he felt something, a twinge of awareness directed toward them. An answering sensation came back, as if they too possessed some rudiments of the Force, or had once been exposed to it. They seemed to feel his touch. All four of them turned in unison to regard the landspeeder again. Boshek could hardly breathe. Fog your brains, he thought to them. Forget I'm here. How long have you had these droids? The stormtrooper captain asked. Huh? Boshek turned his head toward the passenger seat, wondering how he could have missed seeing a droid there, but save for himself, the speeder was empty. He said, but the trooper cut him off. Let me see your identification. Here we go, Boshek thought. He reached slowly for his belt, wondering if he could grab his blaster and take out all four troopers, but the captain's next words stopped him cold. We don't need to see his identification, he said to the others. These aren't the droids we're looking for. Bewildered, Boshek could only say, That's good. You can go about your business, the trooper said. He waved his arm in dismissal. Move along. Boshek's field of vision was shot full of tracers from the sudden rush of relief. He had to take a deep breath to keep from fainting, but he managed to urge the landspeeder forward and around the corner before he pulled it to a stop and collapsed back against the seat. He had no idea what had just happened, except for one thing. The Force was real, and he had somehow manipulated the stormtroopers with it. But not without a price. He imagined the old man probably half a light year away by now, still watching over him somehow, waiting to see if he would follow through on his promise. Would he? It was hardly a question. Boshek had been given a glimpse of something vast, something at once wonderful and terrifying. Beware the dark side, the old man had told him, and Boshek knew the warning was sincere. He could use this newfound power of his for good or for evil, but once he made the choice, there would be no going back. He was standing at a crossroads, and whatever decision he made now would affect the rest of his life. Smiling for the first time in what seemed like hours, he started the landspeeder and began driving it back to its rightful owner. And that is the end of this story. So the next one, which we won't get into tonight, but we'll do next Wednesday, is Dr. Death, the tale of Dr. Evazan and Ponda Baba. So the people who attacked Luke in the Cantina. So we will get to that one next week, and then we've got two more after that. One about a moisture farmer, and the tale of the Wolf Man and the Lamproid, which I vaguely remember from the original. I think they're from the original. And they replaced them in the enhanced version of A New Hope, I think, if I'm remembering right. But yeah, anyway, that's what we've got left in this book. And we'll come back to it next week. Let's see, what time is it? 10? I think I'm just going to go ahead and raid somebody tonight rather than I don't feel like gaming. So I'm going to raid somebody. So please stick around for just a couple minutes. We'll see who's around. We'll see. We've got Mr. Blitzer 79 is playing Dragon's Dogma. Offbeat Outlaw, it says for the King, I don't know what that is. He hardly ever streams. Tofugo is playing Roblox, and Vesper Vidya Retro is playing Diablo 2 Resurrected. Let's go see what Diablo 2 looks like. I've never seen it. If you'll just hang out for a minute or two. All right, I will see you over there.